Stop waiting for the right time. How many times have you caught yourself saying, I'll do it when the time is right? How many times have you convinced yourself that the moment will come, just not yet? Well, I'm here to tell you that the right time is right now. Faith doesn't work in the realm of perfect timing. Faith works in the moment. Often we wait for everything to fall into place before we take action. We wait for the right opportunity, the perfect circumstances, or the ideal timing before stepping out in faith. But that's not how faith operates. Faith requires us to move, even when it's messy, uncertain, and uncomfortable. Faith doesn't wait for the storm to pass. It trusts in God to calm the storm as we walk through it. Think about the story of Peter walking on water. Jesus called him to step out of the boat. And despite the raging storm, Peter obeyed. Was the timing perfect? No. Was the water safe? No. But it was the right time because Jesus called him. Peter didn't wait for the sea to settle or for the wind to calm. He simply trusted Jesus enough to step out of the boat. And while it wasn't easy, the miracle happened when he took that first step. You see, faith isn't a waiting game. It's not about sitting around and hoping for the right circumstances to come along. Faith is about acting in the midst of uncertainty. When God calls you to do something, He doesn't always give you the whole blueprint or all the answers right away. He gives you the next step. And He expects you to move forward in faith, trusting that He will guide you as you go. It's easy to wait when everything is lined up perfectly, but that's not the life God calls us to. He calls us to a life of trust, obedience, and courage. He calls us to step out when it's difficult, when it doesn't make sense, and when we feel unprepared. Faith doesn't need perfect timing, it needs obedience. Think about Abraham. God promised him a land, a people, and a future that was beyond anything Abraham could have imagined. But when God called him to leave his home and go to a place he didn't know, there was no map, no clear plan. All Abraham had was God's word. Yet he obeyed, and his faith became the foundation for the great nation of Israel. The right time was not when everything was secure or understood. The right time was when God spoke and Abraham moved. If you're waiting for the perfect moment to take action, you might be waiting forever. You may be waiting for your feelings of fear to disappear or for all the obstacles to clear, but God doesn't work in the waiting. He works in the moving. It's when we take that first step, unsure of where it might lead, that we begin to see God's hand at work. Stop waiting for everything to be perfectly aligned. The right time isn't coming, it's already here. The moment to act, to trust, and to step out in faith is now. Don't let fear, doubt, or uncertainty hold you back from what God has already planned for you. Trust that He is with you every step of the way, and as you move in faith, you'll begin to see His timing unfold in ways you never imagined. While we often think there's a perfect time for everything, God's plan for us is already in motion, waiting on a sign, is often us delaying His purpose. There's a tendency in all of us to wait for the right moment, the ideal set of circumstances where everything is just right before taking a step of faith. We want everything to align perfectly, and we want assurance that things will work out the way we envision them. But in reality, waiting for the perfect time often leads us to miss the opportunities God has already set before us. God's plan is not bound by our sense of timing. His purpose is always moving forward, whether we see it or not. We are often the ones holding up progress because we're waiting for some external sign to confirm that we are on the right path. But in reality, God's plan for our lives is not dependent on perfect conditions or the perfect moment. It's moving in the background, ready to unfold when we step out in obedience. Think about the Israelites when they were wandering in the wilderness. For 40 years, they waited for the promised land. But during that time, God was shaping them, teaching them, and preparing them for what was ahead. It wasn't that God had forgotten about them or wasn't working on their behalf. It was that He was preparing them in ways they couldn't yet understand. Their waiting wasn't about waiting for the perfect moment. It was about learning to trust God in the middle of their uncertainty. We often believe that if we just wait long enough, the conditions will be perfect. If we wait until we feel ready, then we can take that step of faith. But God works in the waiting. He works in the stepping out, not in the sitting back. We may think that waiting for a sign will give us the courage to move forward, but in reality, waiting is often the very thing that holds us back from stepping into His purpose. The story of Moses offers a powerful example of how God works in ways that defy our human expectations of timing. When Moses encountered God in the burning bush, he was hesitant, unsure of his abilities, and filled with doubt. But God didn't wait for Moses to be fully equipped, nor did he wait for Moses to feel ready. God called him in the midst of his fear and uncertainty. God's plan for Moses was already set in motion, and Moses' obedience was the key to unlocking that purpose. When we wait for the perfect moment, we are often delaying God's plan in our lives. God's purpose for us is already unfolding, and he is waiting for us to step into it with faith. The right time is not when everything is perfect. It's when we trust that God is in control and that he is leading us every step of the way. His timing is not our timing, and his plan is always moving forward, even when we can't see it. Waiting for the right time may feel safe, but it often leads to missed opportunities. It's so tempting to hold off on making a move, to wait for that perfect window of opportunity where everything feels right. We think to ourselves, I'll do it when I'm more prepared, or I'll act when things are more stable. But in truth, this mindset often traps us in a cycle of inaction. The danger of waiting for the right time is that in the process, we miss out on the opportunities that God is presenting right now. The truth is, if we always wait for the perfect moment, we may never act at all. God doesn't call us to wait for the ideal moment. He calls us to act in faith, to trust in his timing even when it doesn't make sense. Waiting for the perfect time often keeps us in a state of fear and indecision. And as a result, we miss the very opportunities that God has placed before us. Think about the story of the Good Samaritan. When the Samaritan saw the wounded man on the side of the road, he didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for the perfect moment or for his life to be more convenient. He saw an opportunity to help, and he acted immediately. Had he waited for the right time, he would have missed the chance to show love and compassion in that moment. Waiting for the right time can also cause us to live in a perpetual state of doubt. We convince ourselves that we need more time, more resources, more preparation. But in reality, God has already equipped us with everything we need to step into his purpose. He doesn't ask us to be perfect or fully ready. He asks us to trust him and move forward in faith. The truth is, the opportunities that God places before us are often designed to stretch us, to grow us, and to deepen our reliance on him. If we wait for the ideal circumstances, we may never take that step of faith that opens the door to the blessings God has prepared for us. God doesn't call us to live in fear of stepping out. He calls us to trust him in the midst of uncertainty. Look at the example of David when he faced Goliath. David didn't wait for the perfect time to face the giant. He didn't wait until he had more experience or better equipment. He stepped forward with what he had, a sling and a stone, and trusted God to take care of the rest. David didn't wait for the right time because he knew that God's power wasn't bound by circumstances. When God calls us to act, he equips us for the task, no matter how unprepared we feel. Waiting for the right time can also cause us to become paralyzed by fear. We worry that we'll make the wrong decision, that we won't succeed, or that we'll fail in front of others. But God doesn't call us to live in fear. He calls us to trust in him, to step out even when we're uncertain, and to know that he will guide our steps. When we act in faith, God moves with us, and his power is made perfect in our weakness. Waiting for the right time often leads to missed opportunities because it keeps us stuck in a place of fear and uncertainty. God is not asking us to wait for everything to fall into place. He's asking us to trust him and act now, knowing that he will provide for every need, and that the right time is the moment when we trust him enough to step out in faith. The journey is as important as the destination. Trust that God will lead you, even when it doesn't make sense to move yet. In our fast-paced world, we often become fixated on the end goal, the destination. We think that once we reach that place, whether it's a dream job, financial stability, or personal success, then everything will fall into place. We put so much focus on the where and when that we forget how important the journey itself is. But God's process for us isn't just about getting from point A to point B. It's about how we grow, learn, and trust him along the way. The journey is where the transformation happens. It's where God shapes our character, builds our faith, and prepares us for what's ahead. just like the Israelites in the wilderness. It wasn't just about getting to the promised land, it was about what God wanted to do in them during the journey. They didn't understand it at the time, but every step they took, every challenge they faced was part of God's greater plan for their lives. Even when the journey didn't make sense, God was leading them. When we focus only on the destination, we miss out on the growth that happens in the process. We get so wrapped up in wanting to reach the end point that we overlook the lessons, the relationships, and the experiences that God is giving us right now. Each step we take, no matter how small or difficult, is part of God's plan. It's in the waiting, in the uncertainty, and in the struggles that we often experience God's presence the most. These moments of growth shape us into who God wants us to be, preparing us for what's ahead. Trusting God in the journey means having faith that He knows what's best for us, even when the path isn't clear. We may not always understand why we are going through certain trials, but God's purpose for us is unfolding every day. Sometimes the hardest parts of the journey are the most important. God uses those moments to refine us, to strengthen our faith, and to teach us to rely on Him rather than on our own understanding. When we take the time to trust God in the journey, we begin to see His hand at work in ways we may have never imagined. The journey isn't just a means to an end, it's an essential part of the process. Each step of obedience, each act of faith is a part of the bigger picture God is creating. And though we may not always see it in the moment, He is using every part of our journey to fulfill His purpose for our lives. Look at Joseph's story. He was sold into slavery, thrown into prison, and experienced years of hardship. But every moment of his journey was preparing him for the position of influence he would eventually hold in Egypt. God wasn't just concerned with where Joseph ended up, He was concerned with shaping Joseph along the way. It was through the challenges, the waiting, and the seemingly senseless moments that Joseph grew into the man who would fulfill God's plan. In the same way, God is working in us throughout our journey. We may not see the full picture now, but we can trust that He is leading us. Our destination may seem distant, but the journey is just as important. It's where we learn to depend on God, to trust His timing, and to understand His purpose for our lives. As we step forward in faith, we can trust that God is leading us exactly where we need to go, one step at a time. Sometimes the right time never comes because God's timing is different from our own. We live in a world that is governed by time. We set our alarms, mark our calendars, and structure our lives around deadlines, appointments, and schedules. This constant focus on timing can sometimes cause us to become frustrated when things don't happen according to our plans. We wait for the perfect moment to take action, believing that the right time will eventually come. But often we find that the right time never arrives, at least not in the way we expect. God's timing is not bound by the constraints of our schedules. His perspective on time is far greater than ours, and His plan unfolds in ways that we might not fully understand. There are times when we feel ready to move forward, yet God asks us to wait. Other times when we feel completely unprepared, He calls us to act. God's timing is perfect because it is grounded in His wisdom, not ours. The truth is, God's timing isn't about waiting for everything to fall into place. It's about trusting that He knows the best time for us to move forward. His timing is perfect because it aligns with His greater plan for our lives. And when we trust Him with the timing, we begin to see that it is always better than anything we could have orchestrated on our own. Think about the story of Abraham and Sarah. God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, but for years, Abraham and Sarah were childless. They had a promise, but they didn't have the timing. They were impatient. And Sarah even tried to take matters into her own hands by giving Abraham her maidservant as a wife. But that wasn't God's plan. In His perfect timing, when it seemed impossible, Sarah conceived and gave birth to Isaac. The promise came to pass, but not in the way they expected, and not when they expected it. God knows the timing that will bring about the greatest good for us and for His kingdom. It might not be the time we have in mind, but it is the time that will lead to our growth, our healing, and the fulfillment of His purpose for our lives. The waiting period can feel like a season of frustration, but in reality, it's a season of preparation. It's in those waiting moments that God is refining us, building our character, and strengthening our faith. While we may feel unprepared or unsure, God is making us ready for what lies ahead. His timing is always aligned with His perfect will. When we understand that God's timing is different from ours, we can release the pressure of trying to control the outcome. Instead of waiting for the right moment based on our own understanding, we can rest in the assurance that God is orchestrating everything in His time. His delays are not denials, they are opportunities for us to trust Him more deeply. When we trust God's timing, we find peace in the uncertainty, knowing that He is always working behind the scenes, preparing us for what's next. So when you feel like the right time hasn't come, remember that God's timing is perfect. It might not fit with your plans, but it will always align with His purpose for your life. Trust in His timing, and in the waiting, you will find strength, peace, and a deeper relationship with the one who holds time in His hands. The time to act is now. God has not called us to wait in fear or hesitation, clinging to the illusion of the perfect moment. He has called us to trust Him, to move forward in faith, and to embrace the opportunities He has placed before us. The journey He has set us on is not about our timing or our plans, but about His divine purpose unfolding in our lives. Waiting for everything to be perfect only robs us of the growth, the blessings, and the experiences God wants us to have right now. It is in the messiness of the present, in the uncertainty of the journey, that God does His greatest work in us. His timing may not align with ours, but it is always perfect, always purposeful, and always for our good. So stop waiting, stop hesitating. Step forward into the path God is calling you to walk, even if it feels uncomfortable or uncertain. Trust that He is with you every step of the way, preparing you, guiding you, and working all things together for your good. The right time isn't somewhere out there in the future. The right time is the moment you decide to put your faith in the one who holds all time in His hands. God is ready. The question is, are you?